Before I move on to some other topics, it's important to talk about the dragon in the room, China. See, I happen to believe that the most important thing going on right now is the proper integration of China into the rest of the world as a fully participating partner. And it's going fairly badly for a lot of reasons. I'm going to skip over as much of the politics as I can, forget about the virus based issues. I want to try to focus on economic and related potential social issues. But it all comes down to this. Well, this is renminbi from a time when Mao was still alive. This was printed in 1970. It has a picture of a woman on a tractor on it. She just died recently in Heilongjiang province. But China has undergone changes that the rest of the world really cannot understand or imagine. And they are trying to manage it as, well, as a centralized authoritarian government would. This just makes sense. But when we talk about the issues at hand, which are the deflationary pressures of technology, demographics, overcapacity in the developed world, and debt, China is the king of pretty much all of those issues, especially the debt. Now, remember I said that the United States has about 4 times its gross domestic product in total debt. That is the public, corporate, personal, everything. China is about 8 times. It's very hard to get reliable figures out of China, but that's what we understand. It's a big change from the time when this bill was printed. And this is, by the way, this is the Chinese yuan renminbi, the people's currency. And, well, right now it's at 7 to 1. This is an important figure. So, what exactly is going on with China? Well, when you think about it, taking out a lot of debt makes a lot of sense if you have a very high growth rate. I mean, China's had 8% growth forever, right? It's going to continue. And this is the modern renminbi bill. This is 100 of them, worth about $14. This has been printed because of a tremendous amount of debt that they have accumulated. And it does not compare to the Western world at all. But it seemed to make sense. I mean, you're moving money forward from the future into the today. If everything is growing, you're going to grow into it. It's not a problem. The Western world was very, very eager to invest in China. I mean, it seemed like where all of the money was going to be coming from. But what if it doesn't? See, there are several problems with all of this. The first one is a very simple one, especially in the post-virus world. There is nothing that China makes that the United States can't do without for 3 months, right? That's where we start from. In terms of what the United States exports to China, well, China imports about 20% of its food. Let's not forget that, and a lot of it comes from the United States. They can't pay for it with this, they have to pay for it with US dollars, and that's what I'll get into next. But China is a good segue from debt to world trade. Now, the trade deficit is about $420 billion. You hear this figure all the time and all that. Actually, the deficit in goods and services is only about $370 billion. That's right. We provide more services, so if you look at a slightly bigger picture, it doesn't look so bad. But we've been doing this for 30 years. I mean, how is that possible? Well, there are 2 reasons. One is what I'll talk about next, the dollar as the global standard. But the second reason is that actually a lot of that Chinese money comes back to the United States eventually as capital. You see, China does not have a modern banking system. These banknotes are printed with a tremendous amount of US aid. And a lot of that, well, winds up going through Hong Kong. I mean, with all of the protests and various things in Hong Kong, you may have wondered why China didn't just stomp down the boot on them, or for that matter, saw Hong Kong off at Kowloon and kick it into the South China Sea. The answer is they can't. Hong Kong exists to feed the dragon. Okay, the tremendous amount of debt that they have, roughly twice as much compared to the United States, is absolutely amazing. And so you have this situation where we have a trade deficit going on, but the capital, the excess money that winds up going to the United States winds up going to China, goes back to the United States in order to keep funding their debt cycle, to keep feeding that dragon, much of it being routed through Hong Kong. All right. So what happens? Where's all that money been going? Well, it's been, building all of the various things that China has directed be built, and all of the corporations, all of that kind of stuff. But what happens when it all stops? And indeed, things have stopped. So, well, this is the problem. China is much more delicate than anywhere else in the rest of the world. Now, in the last generation, about a third of China has moved from provinces to big cities. We're talking about young people getting good jobs, and as is traditional in China, they probably send money home to their relatives in Anhui province or wherever they're from. They're probably the pride of the family. But what if those jobs suddenly stop? What if the incredibly expensive rent in Beijing suddenly comes to an end? What are all those people going to do? This is the problem we have. See, China has not had mass unrest so far because, honestly, things just keep getting better every year. A lot of people who live in China right now remember a time when food was rationed, when starvation was very real. I mean, things are looking pretty good. What's there to complain about, right? That's why there's a lot of ability to tolerate an authoritarian government. But that might come to a crashing halt. And it might come to a crashing halt because of how much of this there is. How much debt, how much currency, how much is going on with China. Now, you might say to yourself, well, who cares? I mean, it sounds like the United States has China completely over a barrel. I mean, that $120 trillion in debt that they have, about 60 trillion, or about half of it, again, good figures are hard to come by, about half of it is denoted in US dollars. And they can't reduce the value of renminbi from 7 to, say, 8 to the US dollar to make their exports cheaper simply because, well, all of that debt becomes a lot more expensive. That's the quickest way to break the system. Sounds like the United States has them over a barrel. Yes, but there's an old adage. If you owe the bank $1,000 and you can't make a payment, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million and you can't make a payment, the bank has a problem. And that's the situation we have. The United States is deeply tied to this. What happens if that roughly $60 trillion in debt that's ultimately dollar denominated breaks? Well, we might have to bail out a lot of banks. And that's where it becomes a problem. So what's going to happen? I mean, first of all, the proper integration of China is, again, I believe, the most important thing that's happening in the world today. So do we simply keep feeding the dragon? That just supports the Communist Party of China. That just makes everything continue. And it makes their desire to control everything even more a reality. I mean, there's a thing called the impossible trinity, which states that you cannot simultaneously simultaneously have free capital inflow, a fixed currency rate, and of an independent monetary policy. China's been doing all three for a long time, and they're kind of proud of that. Look, we have a different way of doing things. The people's currency is dominating, but it's not fully convertible, is it? And if it was, would it be really worth 7 to the dollar? What would happen? If China breaks, the whole world could break. And we have every reason to believe that China could break in the near future. And the potential for social unrest that happens if all of those workers in the cities wind up losing their jobs, I don't even want to go there. Let's not even think about that yet. In terms of what might happen to the West, the problems in China are the problems of the world. We have integrated. And you might just say, okay then, let's just cut off China. Let's just forget about it. That doesn't integrate China into the world. That just isolates the problem. Perhaps we have to do that, or perhaps we have to come up with another solution. There are no good options at this point. We are tied to renminbi and the tremendous amount of debt that supports it. And that is another issue separate in and of itself. but it leads us into a discussion of world trade and how all of the nations are tied together. And that's what I'll be talking about next. But in terms of the basic deflationary problems in the world, nothing exemplifies them better than China. 20% of the world's population. Integrating it is absolutely essential. But there isn't a really great way forward, especially not with all of this debt.